Welcome, everybody, to our deep dive into the Mosel wine region. We got some really interesting sources for this one. Excerpts from a book called Mosel, which, fun fact, is in Portuguese, and 3 articles in English. Our goal today is to give you, the listener, a well-rounded understanding of the Moselle, its history, the terroir, the winemaking, and, of course, those world-famous Rieslings.
Yeah, and what really gets me about the Mosel is that wine is so tied up in its identity, you really can't separate the two. We're talking about centuries of winemaking going all the way back
Oh, really?
to Roman times.
Huh. I always pictured the Mosel as, medieval castles and monks.
Well, you're not wrong. Both are definitely part of the story. So picture this. Roman soldiers marching through what's Germany today, and they stop and plant vines on these sunny hillsides. I mean, they definitely knew good vineyard land when they saw it. And then after the Romans left the scene, it was the monasteries that really made winemaking what it is today. They refined the techniques over centuries.
So it wasn't just communion wine they were making.
Oh, absolutely not. The monks, they were actually really savvy businessmen. They used wine as income, and traded it all over Europe. And speaking of the land, those steep slopes that everyone talks about, those actually turned out to be a huge advantage.
Really? Why is that?
Well, just think about it. Steep slopes mean the vines get maximum sun, which is super important in a cooler climate like the Mosel. Plus, they get excellent drainage, which means no soggy roots. But the real star of the show, that's the slate soil.
Oh, yeah. I've heard all about the famous Mosel slate. What makes it so special?
Well, think of slate as the secret ingredient in Mosel wines. It's like the natural heating pad. Absorbs heat during the day and releases it slowly at night. It creates this perfect microclimate for the grapes right there in the soil. And then you've got the mineral content. It's incredibly rich, which is where those, famous slate notes in Mosel wines come from. You get these hints of flint, graphite. It's almost like you're tasting the earth itself.
Wow, so the soil really does impact the flavor of the wine.
Oh, absolutely. And then you've got to consider the climate, right? The Mosel has what's called a cool continental climate, which means harsh winters and short summers.
Oh, sounds rough.
It is for us, maybe, but it's actually ideal for Riesling.
Yeah, Riesling is definitely the king, or should I say queen, of the Mosel. But why is this climate so well suited to it?
Well, the cool climate allows the Riesling grapes to keep their natural acidity, which then gives the wines that, signature bright, refreshing taste. It's all about that balance between the sweetness and acidity that makes Mosel Riesling so special.
For listeners who are just getting into Riesling, those might sound like contradictory flavors. But it really works, doesn't it?
It does. It really does. And we should mention that the Mosel isn't just about Riesling. There are other grapes grown there, too.
Right.
While it's true, like over 60% of the vineyards are Riesling, you'll also find Müller-Thurgau, which makes those really approachable, easy drinking wines. And then there's Elbling. Elbling is interesting because it can actually create some pretty complex wines. They almost have like this creamy texture, which is surprising considering their high acidity.
So there's more to the Moselle than just the queen of grapes.
Precisely. And here's something that might surprise you. You can even find Pinot Noir in the Moselle.
Pinot Noir.
Yep. Or Spätburgunder, as it's called there.
Oh, wow. Had no idea.
The Moselle is known for its whites, for sure, but they actually make some really lovely, elegant, lighter-bodied reds, too.
That's amazing. I'm starting to see that the Mosel is way more diverse than I thought.
It really is. And that diversity, you can taste it in the different styles of wine they produce. Everything from bone-dry Trocken, which, by the way, just means dry in German, all the way to super sweet dessert wines like Birnauslies and Eiswein.
Okay, hold on. Now you're just showing off with the German.
I can't help it. It's such a beautiful language.
Fair enough. But can you tell us a little bit more about these different styles?
Sure. So it all boils down to the ripeness of the grapes when they're picked, and of course the winemaking techniques that are used. For dry wines, the fermentation process continues until all the sugar is converted into alcohol, right? But for the sweeter wines, the winemaker might stop the fermentation early, which leaves some residual sugar. And then there's the German wine classification system, which uses terms like Cabernet, Spätlese, Auslese. All those indicate the ripeness level of the grapes and how sweet the wine will be.
Oh, okay. Sounds complicated, but I guess that's part of what makes Mosel wine so fascinating.
Exactly. You've got this region with such a long history and a unique approach to winemaking. And it all comes together to produce this amazing range of wines.
Yeah, I can definitely see that. Speaking of history and winemaking, How in the world do they cultivate grapes on those crazy steep slopes we keep talking about?
Hmm.
I mean, that's got to be a huge challenge, right?
Oh, it is. It is. It's incredibly labor intensive. Most of the vineyards are terraced, which basically means they've carved these steps into the hillside to create flat areas for planting.
I can't even imagine how much work goes into that.
It's really impressive. It's a testament to the dedication of Mosel winemakers. They use, a combination of traditional techniques like manual labor, along with some more modern solutions like monorails and cable cars. To get the grapes up and down the slopes, they're literally sculpting the landscape just to produce these wines.
It's incredible. It sounds like a true blend of tradition and innovation.
You got it. And you can see that blend in the winemaking process itself, too. You'll find traditional practices like fermentation with indigenous yeasts happening alongside, modern technology for precise temperature control. It's a really cool mix of old and new.
I like that. Respecting the past, but also embracing the future. But let's get back to the wine itself. What can someone actually expect when they taste a Mosel wine? Like, what are the typical flavors and aromas?
Well, Mosel wines are known for their bright acidity. And then you've got vibrant fruit flavors and delicate floral notes. You might find citrus, stone fruit, green apple, maybe a hint of spring flowers. And then underneath all of that, you'll find that signature minerality we talked about earlier.
That sounds like a sensory symphony, capturing the essence of the Mosel in a glass.
Exactly. The terroir, the winemaking techniques, they all play a huge role in shaping those specific flavors and aromas. The slate soil, the cool climate, the fermentation methods, the aging process, it all comes together to create, that magic in the bottle.
Yeah, I love that. So each wine is a reflection of its place and the people who made it.
Precisely. And that's what makes exploring Mo's wines so rewarding. There's always something new to discover, a new story to uncover, a new flavor to savor.
You've definitely got me intrigued. Now I'm dying to learn more about the people behind these amazing wines.
Well, perfect. Because that's a great segue into our next segment. Let's meet the faces of the Mosel, the dedicated winemakers who keep these centuries-old traditions alive, and who are shaping the future of the region.
You know, we were talking about all the hard work that goes into growing those grapes on the steep slopes of the Mosel. But I'm curious, once those grapes are harvested, where does the magic happen?
It all starts in the winery.
Right.
A lot of times these are historic buildings that have been used for generations. Can you picture those freshly picked grapes arriving? Maybe carried down the slopes in those traditional baskets? Or even on those monorails we talked about.
Oh, yeah. That must be amazing to see.
It really is. And from there, the winemakers use a mix of those, time-tested techniques, but also modern technology to turn those grapes into the wine we love.
I've heard Mosel winemakers talk about using indigenous yeasts. What exactly are those?
Oh, those are yeasts that are naturally present on the grapes and in the winery. They're kind of like tiny fingerprints of the terroir. They give each wine that unique character.
So it's not just about sprinkling in some, like, packaged yeast.
No, not at all. A lot of Mosel winemakers believe that using these indigenous yeasts is like essential to really capture that essence of the Mosel. It's all about letting nature kind of guide the process.
Okay, so we've got the grapes, we've got the yeast. What happens next?
Next up is fermentation. That's where the sugar in the grape juice is converted into alcohol by those little yeasts we were talking about.
And how do they control how sweet the wine is? We were talking earlier about how Mosel wines range from bone dry to super sweet.
That's a great question. So for dry wines, like a Trocken, the fermentation goes until all the sugar's gone, converted into alcohol. But for sweeter wines, the winemaker might stop it early, and that leaves a bit of sugar behind, that residual sugar.
So it's all about timing.
It is. And then comes the aging process. Some wines are aged in stainless steel tanks. That helps keep them fresh and fruity. Others are aged in oak barrels. That gives them more complexity and those spicy notes.
Sounds like there are a lot of decisions that go into making a bottle of Mosel wine.
There really are, and every winemaker has their own philosophy, their own style. Some are very traditional, sticking to those, methods passed down for generations. Others are more experimental, always trying new things and seeing what they can do with a Mosel wine.
And then there are those special super sweet wines we mentioned before, like Bernosellies and Eiswein. Those must be made with some really specific techniques.
You're right. For Bernosellies, the grapes are usually affected by botrytis, which is a fungus that dehydrates them and concentrates the sugar.
A fungus.
Yeah, I know, it sounds weird, but it creates these incredibly intense sweet wines.
But isn't fungus like a bad thing for grapes?
Not in this case. It's often called nubile rot because it creates such, sought-after wine.
Oh, wow. That's fascinating. And what about ice wine?
Ah, ice wine or ice wine that's made from grapes that are left to freeze on the vine. It's another way to concentrate the sugars and acids in those grapes. You get these super rich and luscious wines.
Harvesting those frozen grapes must be a
It
challenge.
is. It is. It often happens in the middle of the night when it's the coldest, and then they press those frozen grapes right away. You only get a tiny bit of juice, but it's incredibly concentrated.
Every step of this process sounds like a labor of love.
It really is. From tending the vines all the way to making the wine in the cellar. The Mosel winemakers, they really are dedicated to making something special.
So for us as wine drinkers, how do we learn to appreciate all this work, all this nuance when we're tasting a Mosel wine?
The key is to just approach it with an open mind and a sense of curiosity. Don't be afraid to try all the different styles, from the dry to the sweet, and
Yeah.
see what you like. Look for wines from different producers, different vineyards.
Are there any specific tips you could give us to get the most out of a tasting?
Absolutely. First, pay attention to the temperature. Mosel wines are best chilled, but not too cold. You're looking at somewhere between 45 and 50 degrees Fahrenheit for the dry wines, and then a little bit warmer for the sweeter styles.
So no sticking them in the freezer?
No, no, that's way too cold. You want to keep all those delicate aromas and flavors intact. And speaking of aromas, use a glass with a slightly narrower bowl. That helps concentrate them, like a classic white wine glass or maybe a tulip-shaped glass.
Okay, so we've got the right temperature, we've got the right glass. Now, what should we look for when we actually take that sip?
Well, first, take a moment to appreciate the color of the wine. Mosel wines, they can range from, a pale straw yellow to golden hues, depending on the grape, the style, the age.
Oh, so there's a visual element too.
There is, there is. Then give it a swirl in your glass, to release those aromas. Take a deep sniff, see what you get. Do you smell citrus, some floral hints, or maybe that minerality we talked about?
Wow, I'm realizing how complex these wines can be.
And then finally, take a sip, let the wine coat your palate. Pay attention to the acidity, the sweetness, the texture. Does it feel light and refreshing or more rich and full-bodied?
What about the finish?
Ah, yes, the finish. Think about how long those flavors stay on your palate. Is it crisp and clean or long and complex?
It's amazing how much there is to think about in just one sip of wine.
It really is. And the great thing about Mosel wines is that there's something for everyone, whether you're a, seasoned wine expert or just starting to explore.
This has all been so insightful. But I think we're forgetting about something. What about the people who are making all of this happen? The people who are making these wines?
You're right, we haven't talked about that human side of Mosel winemaking yet. Let's move on to our next segment and explore the stories of the people who are shaping this amazing wine region.
So we've talked about, the history, the amazing terroir, even those intricate winemaking processes. But now I'm really curious about the people who are making all of this happen. Like, who are these Mosel winemakers?
Well, one of the things that makes the Mosel so unique is that strong sense of family, that tradition. A lot of the winemakers come from families that have been tending these vineyards for generations.
Wow, so it's not just a job, it's more like a whole way of life.
Yeah, exactly. It's about, carrying on a legacy, preserving the land, passing down that knowledge and passion to the next generation. You can really feel that connection to the past when you taste the wines.
But it's not all about clinging to the past, right?
Sure.
I imagine there are some younger winemakers bringing new ideas to the region, too.
Oh, absolutely. There's this really cool blend of old and new happening in the Mosel. You have young winemakers coming back to the family estates after studying winemaking in other parts of the world. They bring, fresh perspectives and innovative techniques.
That's great. So they're finding ways to, honor those traditions, but also push the boundaries a bit.
Exactly. And this forward-thinking approach, it applies to sustainability, too. A lot of the Mosel winemakers are really committed to protecting their environment.
What kind of sustainable practices are they using?
Well, a lot of them are switching to organic farming methods, reducing or even eliminating the use of pesticides and herbicides. And some are experimenting with, biodynamic viticulture, which is this whole holistic approach to farming.
So it's not just about this year's vintage. They're thinking about the long-term health of the vineyards, the whole region.
Exactly. They understand that, protecting the land is crucial for the future of Mosel winemaking. And it's something that wine drinkers are starting to really care about, too.
It sounds like these Mosel winemakers are truly passionate about what they do.
They really are, and you can taste that passion in every bottle.
This deep dive has given me, a whole new appreciation for Mosel wines. It's not just about what's in the glass. It's about the history, the culture, the people, the land itself.
I agree. It's a really special place.
So for our listeners who are now eager to experience Mosel wines for themselves, what advice would you give them?
I'd say be adventurous. Don't be afraid to try all the different styles, dry, sweet, everything in between. See what you like best.
Hmm.
And look for wines from different producers, different vineyards.
And remember all those stories we talked about. The Romans, the monks, the families who've been tending those slopes for generations, and those passionate winemakers who are shaping the future of the Mosel.
All of that adds another layer of enjoyment to each sip.
Well, I think we've covered a lot of ground today. We went from, the history and the terroir all the way to the winemaking processes and the people behind it all. It's been a real deep dive into this amazing wine region.
It really has. It's been a pleasure.
And we hope this deep dive has inspired you to, grab a bottle of Mosel wine,
Yeah.
see what all the fuss is about. Cheers.